Our video is going to present Newell's model of constraints as it relates to the sport of soccer. Evaluating soccer can effectively display the three domains of the model: individual constraints, environmental constraints, and task constraints. Constraints are information that we receive from one's own body and one's own surroundings. They limit the number of choices for one's actions, but they allow for new potential solutions to motor problems. For this reason, every single human action is a result of constraints. Constraints lead to various human movements because one has to adapt to their surroundings and make certain decisions in response to the constraints that are imposed on them. Movement involves force, space, and time, and the individual has to manipulate these three parameters of action based on their perception of the present constraints. Davids states, since perception is specific to the environmental properties uniquely constraining each performance situation, it follows that changing the information constraints during performance can influence emergent action patterns. In this video, we demonstrate various types of constraints and show how an athlete has to adapt and change their movements in the sport of soccer. As described by Newell, an individual constraint is related to a person's characteristics and has two domains. Structural constraints are anatomical structures, and functional constraints are behavioral functions of the body. Andre and Emily have very different structural constraints. For example, height is a structural constraint. Emily is 5'5", whereas Andre is 5'10". This constraint may give Andre an advantage to head the ball over Emily because he is taller. If the ball is being played in the air, Andre might choose to head the ball into the goal, whereas Emily might choose to trap the ball, then shoot. Their different structural constraints would lead to a different thought process and therefore motor actions. Flexibility is a functional constraint. In soccer, it is important to be limber and stretch before every game. As you can see, Emily is more flexible than Andre. This functional constraint allows Emily to be more agile. Additionally, it is important to stretch before you play soccer in order to avoid any injury. According to Newell, task constraints are specific to the certain task, including the rules of the game, number of players, and the equipment used. We demonstrate the idea of task constraints through the explanation of the rules of soccer using various types of practice drills and the varying number of players in the field. One of the rules of soccer is that you are not allowed to use your hands, except if you are the goalie. As soccer players, you probably wouldn't think this rule would change your movement significantly, but if you are able to use your hands, the game of soccer and types of movements made would be drastically changed. During practices, various types of drills will be done in order to increase the skill level of the soccer players. One-touch passing and two-touch passing are examples of drills that create restrictions and require a change in one's movement patterns. Compared to two-touch passing, one-touch passing is more difficult. This task constraint would change the pattern of movement, as it requires more control over the ball and one's own body in employing force. The athlete would have to adapt to the rules of the practice drill and change their movements accordingly. To demonstrate task constraints, we are going to vary the numbers of players and examine how this would change the movement of the athlete. For the first task constraint, we have one player and no defenders. This allows the athlete to dribble slowly and have time to make an accurate shot on the goal. Now we changed the task constraint and added one defender. The athlete now has to plan their actions accordingly. They might have to increase their speed in order to get around the defender. Additionally, they have less time to think about their actions because their opponent is applying pressure while playing defense. With two defenders, the movements of the athlete definitely change. The athlete can no longer make a straight run at the goal, and they also have to vary their speed in order to get past the defenders. Additionally, the force with which the ball is shot on the goal may change because the athlete might shoot from a farther distance. In concordance with our video, increasing the number of players would increase the complexity of the skill and decrease the accuracy of one's movements. For example, having two defenders and one offender makes it more difficult for the offender to have an accurate shot on goal. As Byans predicted, in general, decision-making time increased and response accuracy decreased as the number of players increased. As described by Newell, environmental constraints are external to the individual's body. Environmental constraints can take a physical form such as light, temperature, and ground surface. La Plata Beach is a turf field. This allows for smooth and easy passing and dribbling. This type of surface is sometimes preferred over a regular grass field, but the ball can travel much faster, so the athlete would have to adjust their movements and increase the speed of their run. As you can see, this grassy area has many bumps and holes in the ground, increasing the difficulty in passing the ball. An athlete would have to adjust to this environment and have to employ more force when kicking the ball. Colt Fieldhouse is an indoor field with turf and surrounding walls. With this change in environment, athletes have more decisions in what methods they can use to pass the ball and get past an opponent. For example, playing off the walls is a technique used frequently when playing indoor soccer. The wall is an affordance of this environment that allows for new human movement. Hedrick explains the concept of affordances in the performer-environment relationship. Affordances are opportunities for action provided by specific configurations of the environment, such as objects and surfaces, perceived with respect to the performer's own characteristics such as physical attributes. In conclusion, constraints shift the way we perform movement. Newell's model of constraints is effective because it allows us to examine human movement and gives us an idea about how the environment influences how an individual moves and how the task in one's own body influences what the individual does. These constraints provide information to the athlete, and then they have to adjust to their movements accordingly in the various parameters of force, space, and time.